It was supposed to be the last perfect day of summer. July 14th, 2012, the final Sunday of the East Ridge Summer Festival, and thousands of families lined the grassy hills and gravel paths of the fairgrounds. The scent of funnel cake mixed with fried corn dogs. Children clutched neon prizes. Music blared from a makeshift stage while carnival workers packed up stalls behind rows of laughing visitors. Jacob Weller, age 8, wore a bright blue shirt and sneakers with lightning bolts on the sides. He was holding a cherry slushie, stained red at the corners of his mouth. For most of that day, he stayed near his mother, Dana Weller. They'd watched the clogged dancers. He'd begged for one more ride on the carousel. She said yes. That one yes would be the last thing she remembered before everything shattered. She watched him climb onto the white and gold horse, third row in. The ride spun twice. The operator waved. Donna stepped away briefly, walking toward the nearby portable restrooms. She said later she thought he'd be okay. She could still see the carousel from where she stood. But when she returned, the ride had stopped. The operator was collecting tickets. Jacob was no longer on the horse. At first she assumed he'd wandered toward the snack carts or maybe the prize tent. But after 5 minutes she started calling his name. After 10 she stopped using words altogether and just screamed. The 911 call came in at 6:37 p.m. Her voice was barely intelligible. Witnesses later recalled hearing the name Jacob echoing down the parade route. Within 20 minutes, local police had shut down the parking exits. Loudspeakers asked all families to remain in place. Dozens of fairgoers volunteered to search. By sundown, search dogs had been brought in. Helicopters circled overhead with infrared. Nothing. No footprints. No signs of a struggle. No dropped clothing. His slushy cup was later found in a trash can behind the lemonade stand. But that meant nothing. That day, there were over 2,000 people at the fairgrounds. The trash had dozens of children's cups. The fairground perimeter was cordoned off. Officers walked shoulder to shoulder through the adjacent woods. Divers were sent to sweep the nearby pond. Every carnival worker was held for questioning. Not a single person remembered seeing a child in a blue shirt walk away from the carousel. By 11 p.m., Jacob's photo was released to the press, the same one that would come to define the case. His hair slightly overgrown, a chipped front tooth visible as he smiled next to his soccer trophy. Dana refused to leave the grounds that night. She slept on a lawn chair outside the carousel, waiting for morning. She would return every day for the next week, even after the fair packed up and left town. The East Ridge Police Department, not used to handling high-profile missing children cases, brought in the State Bureau. Investigators reviewed surveillance footage from the food court and vendor area, but much of the security setup was outdated. Some cameras were dummy units, others only recorded on motion, and often looped over their footage within 24 hours. By the time they pulled the files, most were already gone. Media attention exploded by mid-week. National outlets arrived. Candlelight vigils were held at the school where Jacob had just completed second grade. His teacher described him as quiet, but curious. A boy who never liked being alone, who was afraid of getting lost even in grocery stores. The idea that he had simply wandered off didn't sit right with anyone. Police released a statement. They were treating it as a potential abduction. No suspects, no witnesses, no leads. Rumors spread fast. Some said they'd seen a man in a red hoodie pacing near the rides. Others recalled a white van parked behind the fair office with no visible tags. But when those tips were followed up, nothing panned out. The van belonged to a food vendor from out of state, verified. The man in the hoodie was a father looking for his own lost daughter who turned out to be in the bathroom. Every theory collapsed under scrutiny. By the end of the month, reward money had crossed $100,000. The FBI joined the case under the Child Abduction Response Protocol. Behavioral analysts were brought in. They constructed a timeline, pinpointing the missing window to a span of less than 10 minutes. Between the last confirmed visual at the carousel and the moment his mother returned, less than 600 seconds had passed. The area had hundreds of people. And yet no one saw Jacob leave. Not a single scream was heard. No one reported a struggle. It was as if he vanished in plain sight. 12 days after his disappearance, the fairgrounds reopened briefly for investigators to restage the scene. They even walked an actor, same size and weight as Jacob, from the carousel toward every possible exit point. Cameras were set up to simulate visibility. The conclusion was chilling. In the crowd density at the time, a child could disappear, if guided, without raising any attention at all, especially if the person leading him looked like they belonged or looked like a parent. Donna Weller never gave up. She kept Jacob's room exactly as it was. On his birthday the next year, she baked a cake and left the porch light on all night. In interviews, she often repeated the same sentence. "I was gone for 9 minutes. That's all it took." For years, that 9-minute window remained a black hole in the timeline, swallowing everything that came before and after. But the truth hadn't been erased, just buried. Somewhere beneath the noise of that festival, under all the color and laughter and spinning lights, it waited. And 12 years later, the fairground gave something back. The morning after Jacob Weller disappeared, the East Ridge Fairgrounds looked nothing like the day before. The rides were still, stalls half-packed, sun beating down on another eerie silence. Local police had taped off a quarter-mile of gravel and grass, blocking in bounce houses, food vendors, and game booths. Volunteers arrived before dawn, walking shoulder to shoulder across the perimeter. They combed the tree line. They checked drainage ditches, behind generators, even inside the trash compactors. Every corner of the site was canvassed, but nothing. No torn clothing, no dropped shoe, no fresh tracks beyond the chaos left behind by the departing crowd. By 10 a.m., a command tent was set up behind the fair office. Officers and community members took shifts logging tips. That's when a teenage vendor came forward with a detail that hadn't appeared in any of the official accounts. His name was Kyle Baker. He'd been working the ring toss booth for extra cash over the summer. He told detectives he remembered seeing a little boy matching Jacob's description, standing near a smaller tent, tucked between the snow cone cart and the rear fence, one he didn't recognize from the original layout. A narrow booth, beige canopy, no signage except a blackboard with hand-drawn stars and the word Palm. Kyle thought it was a fortune-teller setup, maybe a side hustle from one of the traveling performers. But what stood out was the boy. He was just standing there, alone, holding something in his hand, maybe a ticket. A man, older, white hair in a ponytail, stood inside the booth. Kyle remembered thinking the whole setup looked off. No line, no music, just the two of them. And when he glanced back a few minutes later, the tent was gone. Investigators pressed him on the timeline. Kyle was adamant. It was between 6:20 and 6:30 p.m., the exact window Jacob was last seen. When officers reviewed the official vendor map, there was no listing for any fortune-teller booth in that section. None of the registered businesses claimed it. That space was supposed to be kept clear for fire lane access. Officers returned to the area, now mostly cleared of tents and rides. Nothing remained. No stakes, no chalk outlines on the grass, no zip ties or drag marks, just flattened weeds. But the layout confirmed Kyle's memory. There had been space for a small booth, tucked far enough from the crowd to go unnoticed. Attention then turned to the surveillance system. The fair's security setup had been pieced together from several sources. A few motion-activated cameras on the office building, a dash cam running on the shuttle van, and most significantly, a mounted feed from the main food court pole. That camera faced the general direction Kyle described. Detectives retrieved the feed and played it back. For the first few minutes, everything looked normal. People walking, carts being pushed, lights flickering on. But then, at 6:26 p.m., the screen stuttered. The footage glitched for 8 seconds, a brief digital artifact, then motion resumed. After the skip, the booth was no longer visible. Technicians examined the file. The skip wasn't consistent with hardware failure. There was no storm, no power loss, no known interference. The system didn't crash. It recorded continuously. It simply skipped. 8 seconds, just enough time for a structure to be collapsed and removed if someone was quick, prepared, and knew the exact window. The video before the glitch showed a dense crowd. Afterward, it was slightly thinner, A food cart had shifted. A few kids had run off screen. But no Jacob, no fortune teller, no booth. Detectives questioned every vendor within a 50-foot radius. Most didn't notice anything unusual. But one, a woman who ran the kettle corn tent, said something that raised eyebrows. She'd stepped away to smoke a cigarette behind the food trailers during cleanup. When she came back, she noticed a small beige canopy that hadn't been there earlier. She asked her partner who set it up, and he shrugged. Minutes later, it was gone. She assumed it was a quick pop-up for shade or someone packing up late. She didn't see the person inside, but she remembered something else. A car. A silver panel van with a faded sticker on the rear window, parked behind the tree line where no vehicles were supposed to be. She didn't catch the plates. She never saw who got in or out. Investigators issued a public appeal. Did anyone remember seeing a fortune teller booth or a beige canopy the night of the festival? A handful of calls came in, most too vague or confused. One caller insisted there'd always been a psychic at the East Ridge Fair, but official records said otherwise. Another woman said she remembered the blackboard sign, but thought it belonged to a balloon artist. Nothing verifiable. The story ran on local news that night. Jacob's photo stayed on screen the entire segment. By the end of the week, the area where the booth had allegedly been set up was examined again. Cadaver dogs were brought in. They showed mild interest in a patch of soil near the southern fence, but forensic teams found no trace evidence. No fibers, no fluids, no drag marks, not even a footprint. It was as if the space had been staged and erased within minutes. Officers theorized that if the booth was mobile, designed to fold or collapse instantly, and the person behind it was familiar with blind spots in the layout, it could explain the silence. No one questioned a performer packing up. No one tracked who exited through the back. Jacob's mother was informed of the new lead. She asked if the man in the booth could have tricked him, maybe told him it was a game, or said his mom was waiting. She was told it was possible, probable even, but without a vehicle plate, a name, or a direction of travel, the trail hit a wall. Whatever the booth was, pop-up scam, rogue performer, or something more deliberate, it didn't exist on paper. It left no receipts, no tax forms, no contracts. It had been there for one moment, then not the next. And in that space of silence, something, or someone, took Jacob away. The year after Jacob Weller disappeared was a blur of phone calls, police visits, and headlines that went nowhere. Dana Weller kept every voicemail, every email, every scrap of hope sent her way. She pinned them to the living room wall like a detective, marking out what she thought were patterns, a timeline she believed would eventually circle back to her son. But the lines never connected. They only grew longer. It started with the red pickup truck. A retired firefighter claimed he saw a boy in a blue shirt sitting in the back of a Ford F-150 heading west on Route 19, about an hour after the festival shut down. The tip seemed promising. Traffic cam footage placed the truck near that location. Officers traced it to a man living 2 towns over, a landscaper with a son about Jacob's age. The boy was accounted for. The case moved on. Then came the New Mexico lead. A woman staying at a roadside motel outside Albuquerque called a hotline after seeing a news special on missing children. She swore a child matching Jacob's face had checked in with a bearded man and a younger woman. They stayed 2 nights, paid in cash, and left at dawn. When asked why she didn't report it sooner, she said she hadn't realized who the boy looked like until she saw his face again on TV. Police obtained the motel's guest book. The names were fake. Surveillance footage had been erased. The only remnant was a half-ripped receipt from a nearby diner. No fingerprints, no credit card, no trace. The tip was filed under inconclusive. 3 months later, a postcard arrived at the Weller home. It was blank except for a single word printed in capital letters. Carnival. No stamp, no return address, just a faint postmark smudge and a crease down the center. Donna turned it over again and again. The writing didn't match Jacob's, but she couldn't let it go. Investigators tested it for prints, partials, smudged beyond use. The paper traced back to a common print batch sold in dozens of states. Forensics had nothing. When the media caught wind of the postcard, the story flared up again. But within a week, it was drowned out by a new case. The postcard joined a file cabinet already full of strange, unsolvable fragments. Other tips came and went. A carnival worker in Oklahoma swore a boy had asked for help behind a food tent. A man in Utah found a shoe under his trailer with a lightning bolt on the side. A psychic sent a drawing of a river with 3 stones and a shadow. Nothing led anywhere. Every detail was investigated, logged, closed. 11 leads in total, all of them dead ends. With each one, the emotional cost grew higher. Donna stopped answering the phone unless it came from the sheriff's office. She started drinking. Her husband, Kevin, handled the grief differently. He withdrew. He stayed in the garage longer, slept on the couch more often. By January of 2014, he was gone. There was no argument, no note, just a duffel bag missing and a key left on the counter. He left a message with his brother saying he needed air. When asked later why he didn't take anything from Jacob's room, he said he couldn't bring himself to open the door. Dana never changed the locks. She kept his photos on the wall, but she stopped hoping he would come back. Grief had pulled them in different directions. Hers went inward. His went quiet. What remained was a house full of silence, the kind that clings to the edges of everything. Jacob's room stayed the same, the bed unmade, the soccer trophy still on the windowsill. Each night, Donna lay in his twin bed, staring at the ceiling. She said it made her feel closer to wherever he was. Whether that was somewhere real or imagined didn't matter anymore. Some nights she left the light on. Others she sat outside until dawn, watching cars pass by, counting headlights as if one might stop. The neighbors stopped asking questions. They mowed her lawn, dropped off groceries, watched the porch light flicker longer than it should have. But no one said out loud what everyone was starting to believe, that Jacob wasn't coming back. The investigation officially shifted from active to open but cold in March 2014. It didn't mean the case was closed. It just meant there was nothing left to pursue. The file was thinned down to what could be stored digitally. Physical evidence was boxed, names were cleared, theories were cataloged. The detective originally assigned to the case was reassigned to a different district. A new sergeant took over, unfamiliar with the details. The case lost its momentum, then its urgency, then its audience. The Fairgrounds returned the next summer, smaller now, quieter, fewer lights. A memorial table with Jacob's photo sat near the carousel. People passed by it, nodded, moved on. Donna kept going, slowly, mechanically. She kept her voicemail empty, her blinds half open, her car keys near the door. Just in case. But the town moved on. The school removed Jacob's name from the roster. His class advanced to middle school without him. A new generation of children came and went through the festival gates. And still, no one knew what had happened in that missing hour, or why the postcard said what it did, or where the man from the tent had gone. By the end of 2014, the Weller house felt like a time capsule sealed too tight to break open, but not empty. Not yet. Something had started this story, and something, someday, was going to finish it. 5 years after Jacob Weller disappeared, most of East Ridge had moved on. The fairgrounds still opened each July, the carousel still spun, children laughed, vendors sold the same snacks. But for Donna Weller, every year felt heavier than the last. The sound of music from across the valley each summer was a reminder that no one had been held accountable. No one had seen anything, or so it seemed. That changed in August 2017, when a former ride operator named Ron Halpern reached out to a small-town journalist with a story he said had been eating him alive. He'd never spoken to police, never given a statement, but he claimed he'd witnessed something that day in 2012, something he was told not to repeat. At the time, Ron had been running the spinning barrel ride at the southeast end of the fairgrounds, near the equipment zone. It wasn't a glamorous post, mostly younger kids, long lines, hot metal, but it gave him a clear view of the rear access trail that ran behind the maintenance tents. Around 6:30 p.m., as the parade noise reached its peak near the main stage, Ron said he saw a man walking briskly along the back trail with a young boy. The boy looked out of place. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't holding a prize or a balloon. He just walked, one hand clutched in the man's grip. Ron thought something was wrong. He called out. The man stopped briefly and turned, showing something, a small badge or card in a plastic holder, and said the boy was in protective custody. Claimed he was law enforcement, escorting the child to a family services vehicle. It was over in seconds. The man kept walking. The boy didn't look back. At the time, Ron didn't push it further. The man had moved with confidence. He spoke like someone used to authority. But later that night, when the news of the missing child broke and Jacob's photo hit the airwaves, Ron froze. It was the same kid, same blue shirt, same face. He went to his supervisor, a Fairground logistics coordinator, and said he thought he might have seen something. According to Ron, the supervisor told him it was probably just a misunderstanding and that he shouldn't stir panic unless he was absolutely sure. The next morning, someone from Fair Security reiterated the same advice. Don't speculate. Don't talk to reporters. If police had questions, they'd come to him. They never did. Ron didn't push it. For years, he convinced himself he'd been mistaken. But the memory never left. When he came forward in 2017, the journalist recorded everything. The tone of his voice, the detail he remembered, the timeline, all aligned with the known facts. The time, 6:30 p.m., matched Jacob's last known window. The location, the back trail by the equipment tents, was one of the few areas not covered by any functional surveillance that day. The man's badge claim echoed something investigators had long theorized but could never prove, that the abductor had used a method of authority or disguise to remove Jacob without resistance. Ron's confession reopened part of the case file. Detectives interviewed him formally. They brought in sketches. He couldn't remember the exact features of the man, only that he was white, average height, ponytail, and carried himself like someone who didn't expect to be questioned. When records were reviewed, no agency, local, state, or federal, Bhatti had run any protective custody operation that day. There had been no arrests, no child welfare interventions, no active cases on the grounds. Fairground security claimed they had no knowledge of any such movement, but their internal documentation from 2012 was incomplete. Several logs had been discarded after the event. The operations coordinator from that year had since died. Others involved in security rotation said they didn't recall Ron ever reporting the incident. The Fairground organization, when asked for comment, denied ever instructing staff to keep quiet. They claimed all employees had been encouraged to report anything suspicious. But former workers told the journalist a different story, that image control was more important than transparency, especially when police were involved. Several said they were told not to speak to press under threat of termination. One recalled being reprimanded for creating panic when she described an unrelated incident involving an unattended child in 2013. The culture, they said, was to stay silent and keep operations smooth. Ron's confession sparked a new public interest in the case. News outlets picked it up. Online forums speculated about the man with the badge. Some believed he was part of a larger operation, trafficking, impersonation, or something more organized. Others thought Ron had misremembered, influenced by years of guilt and local rumors. But detectives didn't dismiss it. In fact, the confession aligned with another unverified tip from years earlier. A woman who had claimed she saw a man matching a similar description at a different summer event, talking to children behind a booth. Still, there was no physical evidence, no name, no camera footage, no badge number. The sketch Ron helped create was vague. Nothing concrete came from it. But for Jacob's mother, it was something. It was the first new detail in 5 years that didn't feel like a hoax or a fantasy. She started going back to the fairground fence, standing near the path Ron had described. She asked if there had been anyone else working nearby who might remember. She made a copy of the sketch and taped it to her kitchen cabinet. The badge haunted her more than the postcard had, because this wasn't a message from a stranger. This was a person who had walked right through the middle of everything, through noise, crowds, vendors, volunteers, and left without anyone stopping him. If Ron was telling the truth, then Jacob hadn't been lured. He'd been taken, methodically, under the guise of authority, and the Fairground might have watched it happen without ever knowing what they saw. In early 2020, the East Ridge Festival faced a legal issue that had nothing to do with Jacob Weller. A local zoning board had filed a formal complaint about a large parcel of land just outside the main fairground perimeter, an equipment lot that had remained locked and mostly unused for years. The festival's organizers claimed it had been reserved for storage overflow, but neighbors complained about unregistered trailers, deteriorating fencing, and rodents. What began as a simple code violation escalated when the city required an environmental inspection of the lot. When city workers arrived to document the space, they found 5 rusting trailers lined up against a cracked asphalt wall, all padlocked, all without visible registration numbers. The city flagged it. Police were notified as a procedural step. But when the word trailer and fairground landed in the same sentence, one officer recognized the address from an old internal map of the 2012 festival logistics. The officer who flagged it had worked the Weller case in its early days. Back then, this particular lot hadn't come up, at least not in the official search zone. It had been marked private vendor storage and sat outside the initial 2-mile radius used during the search perimeter planning. No warrant had been issued for it. No one had looked inside. Now, almost 8 years later, a city order gave them full legal access. 2 detectives, 1 forensic technician, and a locksmith arrived on site on a cold Thursday morning in March. The trailers were weathered. One had graffiti tags. Another had tires half sunk into the dirt. When the second trailer door finally opened, the first thing they saw was a pile of broken-down cardboard boxes, folded tarps, and stacked crates of lighting cables. But then, behind the crates, tucked beneath a bent folding chair, was a child's left shoe. It was small, worn, white, with a faded yellow lightning bolt across the side. Investigators immediately photographed it, bagged it, and began clearing the surrounding area. 10 minutes later, they found the right shoe, along with an empty juice box flattened under a coil of wires. It was an old design, cherry flavor, with a plastic straw still attached. No expiration date was visible, but the packaging matched a 2012 promotional run. On the inner wall of the trailer, behind a stack of vendor posters, was a dark stain. It looked like dried blood. The technician swabbed it, marked the area, and called it in. The rest of the trailer held nothing obvious, just the usual carnival debris. But the shoes changed everything. The entire lot was sealed, and the scene was classified as potential evidence in an active missing persons case. Dana Weller was notified within hours. She was asked if she still had Jacob's shoes from the summer of 2012. She didn't. She'd kept a few of his shirts, his soccer medal, a school art project. But the shoes had disappeared along with him. She asked what they meant by matched the description. Investigators said the size and model were consistent. The lightning bolt detail was identical. But that wasn't enough for confirmation. The shoes were sent to the lab, along with the juice box, the wall swab, and several fibers collected from the floor. Weeks passed. Dana didn't leave the house. She didn't tell anyone, not even her sister. She waited alone, in the same room where she'd waited before. When the lab results came back, they were inconclusive. The blood on the wall was too degraded to extract a usable DNA profile. It had soaked into untreated plywood, sat for years in extreme heat and cold, and broken down past viability. No fingerprints on the juice box. The straw had degraded. Swabs from the shoes showed trace DNA, but not enough to distinguish identity. One marker partially aligned with Jacob's profile, but it wasn't enough for statistical certainty. The lab couldn't say yes, and that meant the case couldn't move forward. Legally, the find was labeled as associated objects of interest, not evidence, not proof, just more fragments. Investigators turned their focus to the trailer's origin. Ownership records were thin. The lot had been leased under a parent company that managed dozens of regional fairs. The trailers had changed hands multiple times. There were no logs showing what had been stored inside. The security cameras facing the lot had been disconnected for years. The site hadn't even been checked during the original investigation. because it wasn't on the festival's internal map from 2012. It had been listed as a reserve space for overflow staging. No one remembered who last accessed it. The keys had gone missing years ago. Whoever had used it during the festival likely had temporary access, and whatever was placed there, if it had been related to Jacob, had been hidden in plain sight, sealed away and forgotten. The discovery hit Donna hard. For weeks she didn't speak to the media. She didn't answer the phone. When she did finally appear on a local segment, she only said one thing. He was close. He was right here, and none of us knew. It was the kind of revelation that doesn't bring relief. It deepens the wound. Because if the shoes were Jacob's, it meant someone had taken him through that part of the grounds, stored something connected to him, and walked away. And if they weren't, then someone else had placed them there, knowing what it would do. The trailer was eventually hauled away, sealed, and stored in an off-site forensic facility. The lot was cleared. New fencing was installed, and once again, the case paused, caught between almost and not enough. But it wasn't the last time the ground near that fence line would give up a secret. In the summer of 2024, the town of East Ridge prepared for another festival season like it always had. Flyers taped to storefronts, tents ordered, rides checked, permits signed. But for Donna Weller, the calendar felt heavier than it ever had. Her son Jacob would have turned 20 that July. 2 full decades. She hadn't attended the festival since 2012, not once. Not for the candlelight vigils or the public remembrance walks or the school fundraisers. She avoided the carousel, avoided the road that curved past the parking lot, avoided the smell of fried food, the music, the crush of crowds. But something shifted that year. She wasn't sure if it was the age or the silence, but she felt pulled to the place again. For the first time in 12 years, Donna walked onto the fairgrounds just before sunset, alone, wearing the same faded blue bracelet volunteers had passed out during the original search. It had once read, "Bring Jacob home." The ink had almost vanished. She stood near the edge of the gravel path, about 50 feet from where the carousel had once been. That ride had been relocated 2 years after Jacob disappeared, replaced with a new model, brighter, safer, more open sightlines. No one spoke to her at first. A few people recognized her, but kept their distance. A volunteer eventually approached and handed her a paper lantern. She didn't light it. She kept her eyes on the ground. The music from the stage felt muffled, distant, like it belonged to a different town entirely. Around the same time, a podcast called Missing Frame by Frame aired a 2-part episode on Jacob's disappearance. The show had gained national popularity for re-examining overlooked cold cases. The episode was meticulous, walking through the timeline minute by minute, interviewing former officers, locals, forensic analysts, and even the journalist who first reported the ride operator's story. The final segment focused on the storage lot discovery and then posed a single question. If someone hid Jacob, where would they have felt safe enough to do it on a day when thousands of people were watching? The podcast went viral. Tip lines reopened. Old case files were dusted off again. And like before, most of the calls led nowhere. One woman claimed she saw Jacob working at a gas station in Kentucky. Another sent a photo of a boy she swore had the same eyes. A man from Idaho insisted Jacob had been taken by circus traffickers, though his theory collapsed when he said he'd seen the boy in 2015 wearing the same outfit. Police triaged the messages. The volume was exhausting. But one call stood out, not because of what it claimed, but how specific it was. The caller didn't give his name. He refused to speak directly to officers, only to the podcast host, who recorded the call and turned it over to authorities. The man said he'd worked in construction. In 2015, he'd been part of a subcontracted team brought in to repave and reinforce the foundation of a newly added fairground building, what would become the permanent fair administration office. During the dig, he noticed something odd beneath the existing slab, an air pocket in the soil, and what he described as a makeshift vent pipe that led nowhere. When he asked about it, He was told it was leftover infrastructure from a failed restroom build in the early 2000s. He thought it was strange, but they poured the foundation over it anyway. He was never shown the blueprints. He said it stayed with him. But he never spoke up because he assumed, like most workers did, that the fair had its own politics, that you didn't ask too many questions. Investigators cross-referenced his claim with Fairground records. There was, in fact, a restroom plan proposed in 2003 that was never built, but no documentation suggested any construction had begun. No vent lines had been laid, no permits filed, and more importantly, no mention of soil air pockets or buried infrastructure appeared in the 2015 construction reports. That foundation had been poured quickly, within 2 days, under a private contractor with no inspection delays. The caller had given no name, but the details matched someone on the payroll list. He was tracked down and questioned again, this time off record. He confirmed the story, but refused to go on camera or testify. He just kept repeating, "It didn't feel right. I thought someone should know." The information reignited interest in the site. The admin building was still in use. Nothing had ever seemed unusual about it. But when old construction photos were reviewed, something caught the attention of a forensic analyst working the reopened tip files. In one image, dated 6 weeks before the final concrete pour, a portion of the underlying trench showed what looked like a large plastic sheet tucked into the soil, folded but unnaturally smooth, almost like it had been placed deliberately. The file quality wasn't high enough to confirm anything, but the analyst flagged it. The East Ridge Police Department requested a ground-penetrating radar scan of the site. It was the first formal request they'd made about the fairground in over 6 years. The scan was scheduled quietly to avoid panic or media buildup. Donna Weller was notified personally. She didn't say much, just nodded and asked where exactly they would scan. The officer said, "Beneath the northeast corner of the foundation, beneath the room now used as a seasonal equipment closet," a space no one had ever thought to question. But beneath it, according to one worker's memory, something had already been there, something no blueprint ever showed, and it hadn't moved in nearly a decade. The fairgrounds had changed over the years, new paint, new routes, new attractions, but the southern fence line behind the Ferris wheel had remained mostly untouched. Overgrown, cluttered with aging power cables and old signage, it was the kind of corner no one looked at unless they had to. But in late August 2024, that's where a private investigator named Harris Benton decided to focus. He'd been hired by a nonprofit specializing in long-term missing child cases. Unlike official departments, Harris had time to dig into archival construction records, cross-reference past employee statements, and walk the grounds without a chain of command breathing down his neck. He wasn't there to make arrests. He was there to notice what others had missed. And that's exactly what happened. He brought in 2 cadaver dogs, retired but trained to alert on historical traces of human remains, even decades old. They were guided along the perimeter, past the gravel line where the old maintenance trailers had once been, past the new equipment office, and toward the fence bordering the outer vendor field. That section, long ignored, was believed to be used only for storage overflow. But within 20 minutes, both dogs alerted near the base of a discolored concrete slab covered in old plywood and vines. Harris took photos, marked the coordinates, and sent the data to local authorities. It took days to get approval for a scan. When the ground-penetrating radar team arrived, they detected something beneath the slab, an irregular hollow roughly 20 feet long, 5 feet wide, and set about 4 feet underground. The shape wasn't natural. It wasn't a burial. It was a corridor. 2 days later, with police now overseeing the excavation, crews used jackhammers to carefully break the top layer. Beneath the slab was a narrow shaft, reinforced with decaying wood beams and rusted piping. At the far end, an entry arch had been bricked in halfway, but weak mortar allowed it to be breached with hand tools. What emerged was a passageway that hadn't been entered in decades. A tunnel, roughly 6 feet tall, damp, musty, and sloped slightly downhill. It extended beneath what used to be the original fairgrounds backlot, the section that had once housed stage props, power boxes, and costume trailers in the 1980s and 90s. Over the years, it had been forgotten, paved over, remapped, but someone had known it was still there. Inside, the air was thick with mold and dust. Flashlights revealed piles of discarded mannequins, some toppled and missing limbs, others dressed in faded performance outfits. Plastic toys, melted from heat or time, were scattered along the edges, balloons, masks, party favors from another era. And across one of the walls, smudged just above floor level, were what looked like handprints, small, uneven, and pressed into the grime. Investigators took photographs, samples, measurements. Everything was documented. The tunnel extended another 15 feet before ending in a collapsed segment. Beyond that, rubble blocked further access. Forensics began cataloging debris piece by piece. No bones were found, no obvious signs of violence, but the space itself raised questions that couldn't be ignored. How long had someone known about this tunnel? Why hadn't it been sealed properly? And more urgently, why had cadaver dogs alerted to this exact spot? Trace analysis later confirmed the presence of biological material on several items, including a melted candy wrapper in the sleeve of a child-sized jacket that had been wedged under a rusted shelving unit. DNA extraction was attempted, but the samples were too degraded to yield clear results. One technician described it as years of silence compacted into dust. The mannequins became a focal point, not because they were inherently unusual, but because several had been altered. One was painted to resemble a clown, but had its face partially scratched away. Another had duct tape wrapped around its wrists. A third had a child's party hat stapled to its scalp. Investigators hesitated to interpret these as signs of staging, but the implications were hard to ignore. Someone had been down there. Someone had placed those objects with intention. The tunnel wasn't just an old storage area. It had been used. Donna Weller was briefed privately. She sat through the photos, the reports, the forensic diagrams. She asked only one question: how far was this tunnel from where Jacob was last seen? The answer was 29 yards, close enough to be crossed in less than a minute, close enough to have always been there, just hidden. Construction records showed that the tunnel hadn't been part of official Fairground plans since at least 1995. Most new employees didn't even know it existed. Only a few long-term maintenance staff recalled rumors of an old utility crawl used in bad weather decades earlier. But none had seen it open. None could explain why the slab above it had been patched with such cheap concrete, or why plywood had been bolted over the vent line near the Ferris wheel, a line that had gone unnoticed for over a decade. If the tunnel had been used in 2012, it would have provided the perfect escape route, out of sight, under noise, behind crowd flow. Someone could have led a child there in less than 30 seconds and vanished without a sound. No arrests were made, no suspects named. But the discovery wasn't dismissed. It was added to the case file under a new designation: probable abduction infrastructure used and concealed. The search of the collapsed portion was scheduled for excavation, pending additional structural safety review. For now, the tunnel was sealed again, but this time under chain of custody. Because after 12 years, the Fairground was no longer a place where Jacob had disappeared. It was now a place that had hidden something deliberate, something quiet, and possibly something still buried just beneath the surface. At the far end of the tunnel, just beyond where the passage narrowed and the air grew stale from decades of rot and disuse, searchers came across what looked like an uneven wall. It was subtle, a slight difference in material, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. A forensic tech knocked twice. The echo was hollow. Behind the plastered section was a false panel, framed in plywood and sealed with adhesive foam that had dried and cracked. It came loose with pressure. What lay behind it was a narrow recess about 4 feet wide, wedged between structural beams and old pipework. At first glance, it looked like trash, bundles of synthetic fabric, crumpled vinyl, costume fragments, and lengths of faded bunting. But in the ETR center, half buried under a canvas magician's cape and a plastic ticket pouch, was something else. A child's t-shirt, torn at the neckline, faded blue. The logo on the front was unmistakable: East Ridge Summer Festival 2012. It was the official design from that year, featuring a carousel horse, cotton candy swirl, and fireworks arc. Donna Weller had helped Jacob pick it out the day before the event. She remembered him begging to wear it again on the day of the parade, even though it hadn't been washed yet. Investigators bagged it immediately. The tag was frayed, but still intact. Size 7T. They found small clumps of dark blonde hair along the inner collar. A portion of a tag was still inside the hem. Donna later recognized her handwritten initials in faint marker, JW. The discovery was logged as critical. The material was rushed to the lab. Within 48 hours, the DNA report returned. The hair samples produced a partial familial match to Dana. The degradation made full sequencing impossible, but statistically, the likelihood it belonged to someone else was negligible. Investigators informed Dana in person. They told her the odds, told her it had been hidden deep enough and long enough to avoid detection in all previous scans. But what they couldn't tell her, what no one could explain, was why the shirt was there alone. No body, no remains, no blood, no tools, no blankets, no signs of struggle or containment, just the shirt, placed, folded once at the seam, wedged into a pile of performance fabric like it had been buried in costume storage. Forensics swept the space thoroughly. Nothing else yielded viable DNA. The surrounding materials dated back over a decade. Some had 2010 supplier tags. Others were tagged for destruction as early as 2009. It appeared this section had once been used for prop overflow, forgotten when the tunnel fell out of use. But someone had come back, after 2012, and placed the shirt. It hadn't been there long enough to decay beyond recognition. Fabric experts said it had likely remained sealed in a relatively dry environment. If it had been left out since Jacob disappeared, it wouldn't have survived intact. The shirt had been hidden, but preserved. That small detail shattered Dana in a new way. It meant someone had returned, maybe once, maybe more, maybe just to move something, maybe to hide what had been missed the first time. It was proof, physical, measurable, undeniable, that Jacob had been in that tunnel, or that someone who had access to him had wanted others to believe he had. It reopened every question. Was he kept alive for a time? Was he held there, moved, relocated? If so, why leave the shirt? Why not dispose of everything? Theories spiraled. Some believed it was an act of guilt, a signature left by someone who wanted him to be found. Others believed it was a decoy placed to mislead. A few experts suggested it could have been part of a ritualized pattern, placing personal items in hidden locations to reclaim control over a crime. The behavioral unit from the FBI reviewed the case again. Their profile had long speculated the abductor had knowledge of Fairground infrastructure. That theory now carried more weight than ever. The tunnel was not only known, it had been accessed, navigated, and used in a deliberate way. It wasn't improvised. It was familiar. Investigators tried to track who had been employed during the 2012 set-up and tear-down crews, specifically those with backlot access and history with older fare infrastructure. The records, as before, were incomplete. Many vendors rotated through regional circuits. Some used aliases or changed companies frequently. But one name returned across multiple fare years, a subcontractor responsible for electrical rewiring and booth setup. His name had appeared briefly during the original investigation, but no red flags had surfaced. Now, investigators wanted to speak with him again. He had died in 2019. House fire, unrelated case, no foul play suspected, no known children, no clear connection to Jacob. But he had worked less than 50 yards from the south fence line the week Jacob vanished. The discovery of the shirt did not solve the case. It deepened it. It added proof, but not clarity. Donna placed a photo of the folded shirt next to Jacob's soccer medal on the windowsill. She didn't ask for answers. She only asked for the tunnel to remain open, for the search to continue. Because if that shirt had survived 12 years underground, then something else had too. something placed with just enough care to make sure it was never found, until someone finally decided to look. In the months following the tunnel discovery and the identification of Jacob Weller's torn festival shirt, investigators turned their attention to something, or rather, someone, that had long sat buried in old personnel records. A subcontractor name had surfaced more than once over the years, often in background details, mentioned in emails or handwritten logistics rosters. Ezra Dunley. He'd been contracted to manage temporary infrastructure during the 2012 East Ridge Summer Festival, specifically overseeing booth assembly, electrical routing, and vendor access points along the southern edge of the grounds. At the time, there was no reason to look twice. His employment had been cleared through a staffing agency. No criminal record was flagged. He worked quietly, completed his duties, and disappeared back into the cycle of seasonal workers who floated from one regional event to the next. But after the tunnel's rediscovery and the connection to Fairground layout knowledge, his name came back into sharp focus. When investigators re-reviewed subcontractor lists, they found a discrepancy. Dunley's application had been missing several fields: no previous employment listed, no education history, no emergency contact. The background check used by the vendor agency had been surface level. It never pulled juvenile records. It never flagged sealed entries from out of state. This time, it did. What emerged was a fragmented but disturbing trail. Ezra Dunley had spent his early adolescence in a juvenile detention facility in Ohio for what was described in sealed documents as prolonged confinement of a younger minor. The records were vague. The name of the other child was redacted, but the psychological evaluations suggested a pattern: detachment, manipulation, and ability to blend in with older authority figures. After his release, he changed jurisdictions, bounced through multiple alias-based registrations, and avoided permanent address filings. By the time he arrived in East Ridge in 2012, he'd already worked 6 similar events across 3 states. Most jobs lasted under a week. He preferred roles that allowed access to infrastructure, power grids, storage units, restricted sections of fairgrounds. In 2015, he was briefly investigated in another state after a child reported being followed behind a restroom trailer. No charges were filed. Dunley wasn't formally named in the report. The description was vague. And by then, he'd already moved again. In 2017, he was evicted from a trailer lot in Missouri. The property owner, after noticing unpaid rent and a strong odor, opened the door and found the interior abandoned. But what was left behind raised alarms. Investigators found hand-drawn sketches, some crude, others more architectural, all of them depicting underground layouts, hallways, trapdoors, crawl spaces marked with notes like "quiet zone," "entry no sound," and "costume dump." One sketch appeared to mimic the Ferris wheel section of the East Ridge layout. Another matched a regional carnival site from 2013. There were lists, too: first names, dates, scattered symbols. It wasn't clear if they were real or fabricated. No direct mention of Jacob was found, but some of the documents bore logos from 2012 carnival vendors. Zip ties were discovered in bulk, plastic wristbands, a child's sock so degraded it couldn't be tested. The sheriff's department where the trailer was located logged it all but made no connection to any active case. The evidence sat in storage, unreviewed, until the Weller Task Force expanded its net in 2024 and requested interagency files. When they got the box, they knew immediately what it was. A behavioral analyst who reviewed the materials said the writings exhibited compulsive planning, not spontaneous, not fantasy-driven, but operational, like a blueprint made by someone who had already used these methods and was refining them. The sketches of tunnels beneath amusement rides echoed the one found beneath East Ridge. Down to the vent placement, down to the depth, down to the hidden entry point behind the southern fence. The implication was clear. If Ezra Dunley hadn't built the tunnel, he'd known about it. And if he'd known about it, he likely used it. But there would be no arrest, no interrogation. Ezra Dunley died in 2019. House fire. A converted storage shed on the outskirts of Kansas City. Local officials had ruled it an accident at the time, faulty propane heater. His body was found near the door, badly burned. Dental records confirmed identity. No foul play had been suspected. At the time, he was listed as a reclusive laborer with no known next of kin. When asked if the fire site had been thoroughly searched, local police confirmed it had, but they hadn't considered him a person of interest in any open investigations. They hadn't known who he really was. They hadn't known what he left behind. Donna Weller received the news quietly. No cameras, no press, just a folder. Inside were copies of the sketches, the lists, a copy of the photo from the trailer wall showing the crude Ferris wheel arc. She looked at it for a long time. Then she asked the one question no one could answer. If he did this, if Ezra Dunley had taken her son, why leave the shirt? Why leave anything at all? That question echoed inside the task force too, because the case, once again, had hit a wall. The man who might have held the truth was dead. His records scattered, his victims, if there were others, unconfirmed. But Jacob's shirt had still been found, the tunnel had still been used, and someone, sometime between 2012 and 2019, had gone back, not to confess, not to explain, but to leave something behind that someone would eventually find. In January 2025, during an off-season renovation of the East Ridge Summer Festival's main stage, a two-man crew was assigned to remove outdated lighting rigs that had remained untouched for nearly a decade. Behind a wooden panel near the base of the stage risers, they uncovered what initially looked like forgotten electrical conduit. But when one of the workers leaned in to disconnect it, the panel shifted unnaturally. Beneath the framework was a cavity, small, just 2 feet wide, but deliberately sealed off. A single screw had been painted over. The space behind it wasn't part of any blueprint. When pried open, the workers found a thermal foil blanket wrapped around a plastic container. It was sealed with duct tape and smelled faintly of mildew. At first, they assumed it was just misplaced gear. Then, they saw the corner of a fabric strap, blue nylon, child-sized. They stopped everything and called the police. The container was immediately taken into evidence. Inside, neatly folded, was a backpack bearing the East Ridge Festival logo. It matched the one Jacob Weller had been wearing the day he disappeared, faded in spots but still intact. Tucked in the outer pouch was a composition notebook with its front cover torn off. The pages inside were damp but legible. There were only a few written lines scrawled in a child's hand. One sentence stood out. "I tried to leave. I tried to yell. He said I was part of the fair now." The writing was uneven, letters looped inconsistently, like someone had written them under stress or in low light. Beneath the notebook was a small plastic food container, empty, and at the bottom of the bin, beneath a stained piece of fabric, were partial skeletal remains, small bones, curled, fractured. Forensics would later confirm they belonged to a male child between 7 and 10 years old. DNA testing was expedited. Within 5 days, the remains were confirmed as Jacob Weller. After 12.5 years, the question of whether he had died was no longer a question. The reality hit harder than anyone expected, not because it ended the mystery, but because of where the answer had been hidden all along. The location of the wall cavity placed it fewer than 30 feet from the carousel. It had been within earshot of the parade route, within sight of the vendor booths, and directly beneath one of the main lighting grids used for every concert since 2012. Hundreds of performers had stood above that cavity. Thousands of feet had passed within inches of it, and no one had ever known. The positioning of the foil container suggested insulation, an attempt to slow decomposition or mask odor. The notebook showed no fingerprints. The thermal wrap was commercially available, no unique identifiers. Investigators compared the handwriting to early samples from Jacob's schoolwork. Experts agreed the writing appeared authentic. His. That meant he'd still been alive, long enough to write it, long enough to understand he couldn't get out, long enough to be told he now belonged to something. The implication haunted everyone who read the page. Despite the heartbreak, the case could now be classified. Official cause of death, undetermined homicide. No obvious trauma was found on the remains, though they were incomplete. There were no signs of fire, drowning, or obvious poisoning. But the note, combined with the confinement and concealment, removed all doubt. Jacob hadn't wandered off. He hadn't been lost in a crowd. He had been taken, hidden, kept, and left to die within the fairground's own structure, less than a minute's walk from where his mother had last seen him. Attention turned again to Ezra Dunley. The sketches found in his abandoned trailer matched the stage layout almost exactly, including the panel where the container had been placed. One page, previously dismissed as abstract, showed a dotted box with the words, "Under light grid." When investigators re-examined it, they realized it was a crude cross-section of the main stage. The panel had been installed during renovations in 2010. Only someone with access to construction schematics or detailed build instructions would have known about the hollow cavity beneath the risers. Dunley had supervised lighting rig assembly that year. He had returned in 2012. He had access, timing, and motive. But he was already dead. There would be no trial, no confession, no answers to why or how long Jacob had been kept alive, whether the Etah tunnel had connected to the stage area, whether the shirt was left days before death or months after. All of it remained unanswered. The Weller family held a private service that spring. Jacob was buried on a hillside near the river where he used to fish with his father. Donna did not speak publicly. A statement was released on her behalf. It said only this: "He never left the fair. He was there the whole time. We just didn't look deep enough." A small plaque was placed at the edge of the stage, recessed into the floor where the panel had been removed. It reads simply, "For the child who was hidden but never lost." The case was closed, but justice, for many, never came. Not because they didn't find the truth, but because the truth had waited too long, quiet, buried, and sealed into the very place that had promised joy. The fairground reopened that summer with a new theme and a redesigned layout, but some things couldn't be covered over, because now everyone knew. Jacob Weller hadn't disappeared. He had been taken, and the fair had held him silently for 12 years.